Everyone, this is Nikachu, Merfolk Master, and today I just want to go over the latest 5-0 Merfolk list that has popped up on Magic the Gathering Online. The 5-0 was done by Rothgar13. Rothgar is a very prominent member within the Merfolk community. He's a very seasoned player. He's been around. He knows his way with Merfolk, and he's got the latest 5-0 with Mono Blue Merfolk, no doubt. Just showing, and he's not the only 5-0 out there. Merfolk is getting 5-0s on some semi-regular basis, so this is not a dead tribe. In fact, I think there's like more Merfolk lists than spirits. We're being more represented than them. So Merfolk's still very playable and competitive. Let's go over his list and his choices. So there's a lot of stock cards in here, but very notably that there are no Master of Waves. So like the Merfolk community, I think, is in agreement that Master of Waves is in a little bit of trouble. It's very slow and is weak to two particularly powerful cards very commonly seen right now in Modern. The first one is Walking Ballista. You're going to find Walking Ballista in normal Tron and Eldrazi Tron, but not to mention any Karn the Great Creator deck, any deck playing that card, and that is tons of decks between Tron, Mono Blue Tron, Eldrazi Tron, and a variety of other shells that are just jamming the card because why not? It's a colorless card. If you're any sort of control-ish deck, you can run this thing. So Karn the Great Creator can search for Walking Ballista and just annihilate our board. So that's not good for Master of Waves. Another problem, of course, is Plague Engineer. So if you don't have a Lord out, then Master of Waves is just going to die on the spot. Not to mention, even if you do have a Lord out, you have a few Lords out, and you make 1,000,000 Elementals with Master of Waves, they can still name Elemental with Plague Engineer, so Master of Waves has lost a lot of strength recently. And it's really sad, because it's going to be hard to see another time that it's going to be very well positioned. We're going to need to see red decks really come back in a big way for us to bring like Master of Waves back into the deck. Because otherwise, it's very slow against a variety of matchups, too weak against Walking Ballista, and then just a sitting duck against Plague Engineer. And I guess we can go over one more thing about Master of Waves. Because it's 4 mana, that is getting incredibly expensive for the format. Right now, Modern is very hostile. A lot of decks have God draws, and Master of Waves becomes a liability. I would say there are less and less matchups that go into the long game. I mean, even against Blue-White Control, I don't even want to go into the long game, because the moment they play Jace the Mind Sculptor or Teferi, the game's basically over. You have to kill those planeswalkers or you're just going to lose in the next few turns. So there's almost no deck that you want to go into the long game anymore. It's really, really fast, and any decks that sort of go into the mid game, you just want to make sure that they're almost dead by that point, like against those control decks. You want to have a lot of pressure early on, and hopefully when you're reaching the late stages of the game, they're almost dead. So no Master of Waves. We've got Benthic Biomancer, basically the best blue drop in Mono Blue. You can make a little bit of a case for Curse Catcher. I've seen some lists that get published with Curse Catcher. There are more spells now in Modern than there were in the past, but they're still very cheap spells. Really hard to tax their mana with Curse Catcher. Benthic Biomancer is the most reliable one drop because it can turn into a 2/2 later on, and you can loot away cards for things that you need. So notably, we've got 4 Lord of Atlantis, 4 Master of the Pearl Trident. But you know what? Rothgar's not stopping there with the Lords. 4 Merrow Reejerey, so this is a nod again to Plague Engineer. You need more Lords in order to push through that damage and to keep your creatures alive. Another thing that's a benefit to Merrow Reejerey, though, is against a Plague Engineer, if you play a Merfolk, you can tap the biggest creature on the board down, like a Tarmogoyf or a Scavenging Ooze, making your attacks a lot easier. Not to mention, Merrow Reejerey, I think, is pretty well positioned against both humans and Eldrazi Tron because of, well, it's explosive, so if they don't kill it, you're going to have a really big turn 4, and yeah, that's basically it. And you need that sort of card that can helps speed you ahead against humans, which is really mana efficient. They use both Noble Hierarch and Aether Vial. They get to these situations where they're playing 2 things a turn and they tempo you out. Merrow Reejerey gives us the opportunity to play 2 things a turn. Another thing that's going for the Lords is that they help you get out of range of Walking Ballista. Again, a lot of Karn the Great Creator decks that are playing with Walking Ballista, Merrow Reejerey is going to be there for you to keep the creatures very large. If you go turn 2 Lord into turn 3 Lord, all the creatures are going to have at least 3 toughness, and even if a Walking Ballista comes down on 2, if they get to untap with it and add like 1, or even if they add 2 more counters, they can only kill 1 Lord and don't have enough counters for another Lord. So Merrow Reejerey is going to help buff the creatures up to get out of range of Walking Ballista. And again, good against humans. You get to play extra things a turn, but you also can tap down their creatures, which also help clear, like, you know, if they got a big champion of the parish, who cares? Tap it down, attack through, get in that damage. Also stock cards still here. Silvergill Adept. For Merfolk Trickster, also a very stock card. So Harbinger of the Tides combos really well with Merrow Reejerey. You can force the action by tapping their creature. When you cast the Harbinger of the Tides, it enters the battlefield and you can bounce it. Harbinger of the Tides, though, is relatively well positioned because of Izzet Phoenix. That's one of the biggest decks in the game right now. And when they play Thing in the Ice and they flip it into a 7/8 Awoken Horror, you can undo all their work by bouncing it back to their hand with Harbinger of the Tides. So they spent all their cantrips in order to flip this Thing in the Ice. They bounced your board, but then when you bounce that thing back to their hand with Harbinger, they're like really tempoed out. They got to recast the Thing in the Ice, and then they need 4 more spells in order to bounce everything again. And to make matters worse, usually they have to kill this Harbinger of the Tides, because if they don't, there are situations where they keep bouncing your Harbinger of the Tides back to your hand with other Thing in the Ices. So that you might have this chain going on forever. So Harbinger of the Tides good against that deck. Relatively good against Eldrazi-tron, bouncing Reality Smashers, Thought-Knot Seers. The only problem is if they see your hand with Thought-Knot Seer, they'll have really good information and they might be able to play around it. But Harbinger being played in this list. What else we can say about this? For Force of Negation. Force of Negation, basically the Force of Will for Merfolk. It really was the best card that they could print for Merfolk in Modern Horizons, and it was a card that Merfolk can utilize the best. We're going to be tapping out a lot on our turn, and we have more opportunities for turn 4 kills if we tap out, putting the Lords on the battlefield, and then we just try to protect our team with Force of Negation. Force of Negation is also really important right now because all these Faithless Looting decks can really abuse the graveyard on early turns, but if we Force of Negation that turn 1 Faithless Looting, we can slow them down significantly, in some cases just destroying their hand. If they mulligan down to if they mulligan 2 or 3 times, hoping for a Faithless Looting to fix their hand, and you Force Negation that 5 or 4 card hand, they're done for. They almost never come back from that. So Force Negation there to give us free wins against those greedy Faithless Looting decks. But not to mention, it's good against any control deck. It's even good against attrition-based decks, because you still can cast it for 3 mana, or you have the you can still 2 for 1 yourself if you want, but that's at your discretion. It's not mandatory. You can pay 3 mana to just hard cast it for 3 mana. So nothing unusual here for Aether Vial, for Spreading Seas. And if you look at the land suite, 10 islands, 1 Minamo, School at Water's Edge. There is a little bit of synergy with that in this deck because of the Venser Shaper Savant in the sideboard. It's a legendary creature, so in theory you can untap the Venser. We got 4 Mutavaults, 1 Oboro, Palace in the Clouds, and 4 Waterlogged Grove. And so it's an interesting choice because the metagame is actually pretty aggro, and I have found that there's a lot of games where I'm not actually cracking these Waterlogged Groves, I'm just taking a lot of damage from them, and that damage is adding up against like Mono Red Phoenix or a Hogak deck, or even Jund or Esper Death Shadow. But it's still up in the air what is the right number of Horizon lands that should be in Merfolk. 4 seems to be an okay number. it's probably clear that you can't go above 4 unless you're going above 20 land. But it's interesting to think about how is 4 the right number? Is 2 maybe the right number in a very aggressive metagame? Well, Rothgar played 4 and did fine with it. Also interesting that he didn't divide them. That is actually slightly relevant because you could play 2 Waterlogged Grove or you can play 2 Fiery Islet, and I think it's just free. He doesn't play any green cards in this deck, nor red cards, so it doesn't matter. And you do that to play around Sorcerer's Spyglass and Pithing Needle, which are seen out of the Word deck, although it's a niche interaction, but it's free to play around. So sideboard, 4 Deprive. So after you have your 4 Force Negation and 4 Deprive, you should be good to go against most control decks and also the combo decks. Why Deprive over other counter spells? Because it's a guaranteed counter spell, and on top of that, it's guaranteed on turn 2. So if you play turn 1 Aether Vial, you can have Deprive up on turn 2 immediately without needing any other requirements. Some people say, well, why not Wizard's Retort? Because you don't always have a wizard in play. That's the problem with Wizard's Retort. And if you play with Wizard's Retort long enough, well, you're going to lose a pretty decent chunk of the games because you just couldn't cast your card. You might have 4 mana up and you play Lord of Atlantis and you just don't have another wizard, so you get screwed. Deprive is much more reliable. You sort of tempo yourself out, but you know what? We're not even playing with Master of Waves anymore, so that liability is shrunk down a lot. So you're not waiting. We're not trying to curve out to 4 mana anymore. The top of the curve here is 3, so depriving at any point in the game isn't going to be a big tempo blowout. So 4 Deprive. 2 Echoing Truth, just a regular counter spell, also something to bring in against humans and stuff if you're siding out things like Force of Negation. Yeah, so Echoing Truth, though its main purpose is to bounce Ensnaring Bridge against any deck that would be bringing it in. But it's a normal removal spell, and there are a decent chunk of decks with tokens. Storm is still out there, and I have seen these Is it Phoenix decks taking a Storm hybrid with Empty the Warrens. You could bounce those tokens with Echoing Truth as well. And also the decks that you would see tokens featured would be Mardu Pyromancer. The tokens coming from Seasoned Pyromancer and Young Pyromancer are good targets for Echoing Truth. 3 Relic of Progenitus. This is the removal spell of choice for most of the Merfolk community. It's a piece of artifact hate that can replace itself. So if your opponent plays Shenanigans or Assassin's Trophy or any sort of artifact removal, you can crack it and get a card and get value out of it. So I mean, if you play Grafdigger's Cage, your opponent's graveyard is intact, and then by the time they play Shenanigans on your Grafdigger's Cage, graveyard is still there, active, waiting to pounce back and kill you. But with Relic of Progenitus, if they try to interact with Relic, you crack it, empty the graveyard, draw a card, get value out of it. So Relic of Progenitus, that is why it is played in this deck. And also Relic is brought in against some Snapcaster Mage decks if you want to, although Deprive does a pretty damn good job against Snapcaster Mage decks because you can just deprive the Snapcaster Mage. 2 Dismember. Dismember is very well positioned, mostly against the Plague Engineer decks. You can also bring it in against humans and Eldrazi-tron, but you're still taking a lot of life. I think it is worth it against Eldrazi-tron, though, because they are spending a lot of mana still to they can spend up to 4 mana or at least 3 lands to cast their Thought-Knot Seers, their Reality Smashers, and then for 1 mana to be able to kill those things. Really big tempo boost to get ahead in the game. So, but Dismember is also there for Plague Engineer. So if you really need to kill that Plague Engineer, if they have 2 of them out for some reason, Dismember it away, it's dead. And another thing is that like Mardu Pyromancer has a lot of deadly cards, both in Young Pyromancer, which can get really out of control, but also Yawgmoth. Yawgmoth is a ridiculous card where they can sacrifice another creature, put a -1/-1 counter on a creature, and draw a card. That card gets out of hand very quickly. You want to kill it very quickly. You want to dismember it. They might still get too much value before the Dismember resolves, but it's the best chance of hanging into that game anyway. So Dismember, versatile removal spell. You can bring it in against any of the control matchups. So we got Phyrexian Revoker. Phyrexian Revoker, it actually shuts off a lot of cards. I mean, you can name Walking Ballista, you can name Expedition Map, you can name Planeswalkers, you can name Mana Dorks. So this card has multiple function utility. You can bring it in against Affinity, name Orcbound Ravager, you can name Cranial Plating. So Phyrexian Revoker actually is like quite an amazing card. And it's also a 2/1 creature, so in matchups where your opponent has very few blockers in the way, it will be a fine 2/1 creature just to get in for damage. This might happen against like normal Tron or a blue-white control deck, where a 2/1 creature for 2 mana is going to get in a lot of damage anyway, so Phyrexian Revoker is good there. And the best part of Phyrexian Revoker is if you have an Aether Vial, if your opponent plays a card with an activated ability, in response, you can activate your Aether Vial, put the Revoker in play, and name that card. And lastly in this list, 2 Venser, Shaper Savant, a versatile bounce spell, also good against Ensnaring Bridge decks, but also a potential counter spell. Counter spell, you return the card back to their hand. So if your opponent plays Supreme Verdict, you can bounce it back to their hand. But also fine in creature matchups. So you could bring it in theory against humans. I think it's a bit expensive, but it's still something. You can bounce their Deputy of Detentions, get your cards back. Really good against blue-white control though. You can bounce a variety of cards, including like Detention Sphere. You can bounce your own cards back to your hand. You can bounce Supreme Verdict, of course, or at the right moment they tap out for Cryptic Command. You Venser, you bounce it, you attack for the win, and also relatively good against other clunky creature matchups. So that is the list. It went 5-0. I know that Merfolk is still competitive right now. You're seeing this 5-0. We're gonna go over all the 5-0s as they become published. I'm really happy to see this. Congratulations to Rothgar for getting a list published, and for his performance in Magic the Gathering overall. So anyway, this is Nikachu talking about the latest 5-0 list that came from Magic the Gathering Online.